Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm speaking with someone who's involved with the cause for beatification of Spain's most famous modern architect, Antoni Gaudí. Hey everybody, before we get into today's interview, I just wanted to make some comments about episode 29, my interview with Abigail Ryan-Favalli about Catholic feminism. A few of you emailed me with complaints about the episode, saying that I had essentially botched the interview, I talked way too much, and got in the way of introducing people to Abigail's brilliant work. And I have to say, in retrospect, I totally agree. I realized that the topic of feminism, I think, causes me to rant a little bit, and I failed to restrain myself. I just got a little bit overexcited. I was also very excited to have Abigail on the show because her book is really great. So I want to apologize for that. And actually, I went back and re-edited that episode and cut about 20 minutes of myself out of it. So I think it's more listenable now. But again, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to Abigail as well. Of course, I expressed that to her, that I did a poor job of serving her work in that interview. So, I'll of course do better in the future, but I want to thank those who wrote in with their candid, constructive criticism and also the very kind compliments that they gave otherwise on the show. It was encouraging that they thought I had done a good job, a professional job on the other episodes they had heard, and that was somewhat of a fluke. But it's just a good lesson in being aware of myself and having a certain detachment if there's a subject matter that tends to rile me up. For those who felt like they didn't get a good sense of Abigail's work in that episode, I still advise you to go to the show notes page for that episode. That would be catholicculture.org/episode 29, and there you can find links to a couple of her articles. I recently had an excuse to visit Spain at the end of December and early January because a friend of mine was getting married there. And like many people, the one image of Spain I had in my head up to that point was of these gigantic, odd-looking, sort of organically shaped spires on a large church in Barcelona. I was also aware that this church had been under construction for over 100 years and still not completed, which I found fairly intriguing, namely the Church of La Sagrada Familia. So when I was in Barcelona, I made a point of visiting this church, and in fact, I spent a whole day on various works by this same architect, Antoni Gaudí. I visited also an apartment building and a park that he designed. Gaudí's style is somewhat difficult to describe, especially for a non-architect like myself, but it's unmistakable. He's all about the curves, not about straight lines. Forms inspired by nature, things that look like they were taken from the forest floor or deep underneath the ocean. It's also very colorful. Some of it has an almost fairy tale or gingerbread house quality to it. Now, as I spent that day learning about Gaudí, his life and work, I became aware that he was quite a pious Catholic. And in fact, towards the end of the day, when I was at the museum adjoining the Sagrada Familia, I found a little prayer card with a prayer for his canonization. Having spent the past several hours coming to really respect this man as an artist and be inspired by his creativity, I found it very exciting to learn that he was quite an ascetic, that he had a deep devotion to the Holy Family, to Our Lady, to St. Joseph, whose feast day it is today, and to the Divine Child Jesus. And of course, this podcast is dedicated to the Holy Family, so this is an especially appropriate topic. So when I got home, I got in touch with the Association for the Beatification of Antoni Gaudí, and they got me in touch with one of their people who speaks English, a lawyer. I'm going to try to pronounce her name properly now, Gabriela Gonzalez-Cremona. So she's going to tell us about Gaudí's life and work and the cause for his beatification. Gabriela, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we start talking about Gaudí?
Well, I would like to say that I'm a collaborator of the Association Pro Beatification of Antoni Gaudí. And this association is a civil association and started in 1992. I'm always collaborating in giving conferences and things, but I'm a man amateur. I'm not an expert on Gaudí, but I'm very interested in his figure and his holiness.
So the canonization effort has been happening since 1992. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
In Barcelona.
Well, maybe before we get into the details, you can just give our listeners a general overview of who Gaudí was and what his importance to the world of architecture was and Spanish culture.
Well, when Gaudí studied architecture, he met the most important architectural styles throughout history and had the main influence of the Neo-Gothic style, Arab and Oriental art. And then this was the influence in Gaudí from the very beginning, but then he evolved in a personal style that was not the Neo-Gothic, was not the Arab or Oriental one, but his own style and influenced especially by nature.
So what would be an example of Gaudí's influence from nature?
For instance, when you see the Nativity facade, you can see that everything are just people, plants, flowers, birds, animals, all kinds of animals. And you can see that Gaudí was very fond of nature. And this is because he had problems when he was a child. He suffered from rheumatic fever. He was very ill. And so he spent long periods of time at home. And his mother brought him to the country. And then he used to study the nature. And he used to play with animals, etc. And so this is the great influence in Gaudí of nature.
Yes, I visited the Sagrada Familia a few months ago. I was in Spain in December, and I was able to visit the Sagrada Familia and a couple of other Gaudí works. And I saw in the Sagrada Familia, there is, in the interior, there are these large pillars which are modeled on trees, like tree trunks. And I read there that he designed them in such a way. In other words, his influence from nature was not only aesthetic, but functional as well, because he designed the sort of branches of these pillars in such a way that they allowed a maximum amount of light down into the space, just as the branches of a tree do, because they rotate in such a way that the upper branches don't keep light from getting through to the leaves down below. So it was very interesting.
Yes, it's very interesting. And also, as you can have seen in Barcelona, also the interior of Sagrada Familia has the nature as the protagonist, and especially these trees that actually are the columns that support the weight of the building, because as you know, the stained glass windows are very big, and so the supporting of the building has been made through the columns, not the walls. Gaudí wanted a great amount of light entering inside the church.
Now, did Gaudí study with any other architects of the day, or did he associate with them and learn from them?
Yes, he associated with an important architect of this time, and this architect was the person who made him to enter to work in Sagrada Familia, because as you know, Gaudí was not the first architect in Sagrada Familia. There was another architect. The previous architect was Mr. del Villar, that was a diocesan architect. And then this architect was supposed to project a very simple church with just one tower dedicated to St. Joseph. And then 1 year after starting the works, he had problems with the commission of the works, and then he decided to leave. And then young Gaudí entered to work in Sagrada Familia, but was not the first architect. And when he started working, the crypt had been already started.
I see.
This architect was Martorell, and as Martorell had been the person who decided not to maintain the previous architect, he said, well, it is not fair that I started working instead of this architect. Maybe it is better to put a collaborator of me, and he decided to appoint Mr. Gaudí.
Oh, I see.
That was very young at that time.
Do you know how old he was?
31.
31, okay.
Yes.
So now Gaudí is considered to be for those who don't know, Barcelona is in the region of Spain known as Catalonia, which has a very ancient sort of distinct culture and language of its own. And Gaudí is considered a very uniquely Catalan artist. So is there anything that you see about Gaudí's work that is distinctly Catalan in spirit?
Yes, this spirit of Catalonia, well, Gaudí lived in a period in which textile and naval industry in Catalonia were very important, were being developed, and then this generated a wealth and a demand for the work of immigrants from other regions of Spain. And this made that in this time there was a sense of nationalist pride that was called Renaissance, and it was a cultural and literary movement with a predominance of feelings, patriotic and historical exaltation of the costumes, the traditional festivals and the language. And Gaudí was a nationalist, had this nationalist feeling as well. And so he was very proud of being from Catalonia.
Now, what decade are we talking about here when Gaudí started working on the Sagrada Familia?
When he started in Sagrada Familia, it was 1883.
Okay.
Because the work, the Sagrada Familia started in 1882.
Okay.
1882.
So
yes.
he was born around 1850.
52, yes.
Okay. What was the sort of political situation in Catalonia at that time? I'm just curious because I know that there have been many movements for independence throughout the history of Catalonia in Spain, and there's one now. But what was the sort of relationship of Catalonia to the rest of Spain at that time?
Well, it was quite different from now. Now, this nationalism is being separatism, actually. But at that time, it was just nationalism, but inside Spain. Gaudí, for instance, was Catalanist, but not separatist. I mean, he wanted to be Spanish, but he was proud of being Catalan. Because Catalonia was a wealthy region in Spain, and so they were proud of being Catalonian, but not separated as nowadays is happening.
I see.
Nowadays we are having serious problems.
Right.
But it is nothing to do with this time of the.
I see.
I see.
Are you from Catalonia yourself?
No. I'm from Madrid.
Got it.
This is a problem because nowadays we're having very serious problems with these people, and this is a very big problem. And we were speaking to the Pope in Rome some time ago and requested him to pray for Catalonia. He said that he's praying for us.
Great. So now, was Gaudí a lifelong Catholic? Was he born into a Catholic family? I would assume as a Spaniard.
He was a Catholic. His family was Catholic, and he studied in a religious school when he was in the high school. And then he came to Barcelona with his brother Francisco to study architecture. But it was because of his work in Sagrada Familia that he became religious. Because when he started working in Sagrada Familia, he was becoming famous and earning money for the other works in civil works, and he was not interested in religion. But it was because he had to study the gospel in deep in order to better make his work that he, little by little, was becoming more religious.
Okay. So how did his faith begin to influence his work, even his secular work?
Well, when Gaudí, as I told you, came to the Holy Family, to the Sagrada Familia, he was very young, but he started to study the gospel, and he started to study the gospel in deep because he wanted to make very well his work. And then he became more religious, and then it's interesting to know that both civil works and Sagrada Familia, for instance, he was working at the same time in civil works and always put religious symbolism as, for instance, the cross, a dedication to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, etc. in all the civil works, apart from Sagrada Familia, in which he he devoted all his life, in fact, and he put a lot of symbolism, and all the sculptures, if you have seen a few months ago Sagrada Familia, you can tell that it's true, that all the sculptures are outside the temple, because Gaudí said that he knew that maybe in future people wouldn't be interested in going inside the temple. And then he decided to put everything outside for people to see it just going by the street.
I see. So
And
he
this
thought
is the
that people would
faith.
not be interested unless they had something on the outside to attract them to come in. Is that the idea?
Yes. Yeah.
I see.
Yes.
Yes, I also visited the apartment building he designed, La Pedrera.
Yes.
And was that one dedicated to the Queen of the Holy Rosary? Am I right about that?
La Pedrera was designed by Gaudí to be the base of a large sculpture dedicated to the Virgin Mary and the Child. That was supposed to be an important reference in Barcelona, in Paseo de Gracia. But when the work was being ending, the tragic week of Barcelona occurred and many churches were burned. And so the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Milà, said that they didn't want to put the statue of the Virgin Mary. And so Gaudí was so angry that he decided to leave, because he said that La Pedrera was actually the most important thing was the image of the Virgin Mary on the top. And so this building was not completed without this Virgin. And so nowadays the Association Pro Beatification of Gaudí are fighting for putting this image of the Virgin on the top, but the owners are not interested at all.
So, but
Yes.
there are other sculptures that he put on top. So were those there before, and then he was going to put the Virgin Mary as the sort of the main centerpiece of it?
In La Pedrera?
Yeah, I went to the roof, and they have all these different sculptures based around the elements.
Yeah, but in the roof there are chimneys. It is very beautiful, but not any sculpture is. There are not the sculptures, just the base, which is the building, and then nothing on the top.
Okay,
because,
I see.
Yeah, no agreed in putting anything.
Right. So those are just chimneys. Okay, I see.
Yes, the chimneys which are very beautiful, and you can go in summer. You can go there to have a drink, and it's very beautiful. But it is not the main purpose of this building. That was to put the Virgin Mary.
Now, what is this tragic week of Barcelona that you mentioned?
The tragic week was in 1909, and it was a special week in which Republicans decided to fire all the images, all the religious images, and all the churches, and even Sagrada Familia was burned. And a lot of different sculptures were burned, have been restored after years.
So the Republicans, this is before the Civil War, correct?
Yes.
So
yes.
but the Republicans, for people who don't know, those would it be accurate to say they were the communist faction, essentially? Or is that wrong?
More or less, yeah. A lot of different workers that were not... But especially it was, this movement that people wanted to fight against the church and against all the religious images. And it was horrible because a lot of churches in Barcelona were burned, and it was a tragic week, as the name says.
Yeah. So, and there were a lot of priests murdered, were there not, at that time?
Yes, as well, yes.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
So, could you give an overview of the other types of projects that Gaudí worked on? We've mentioned the Sagrada Familia and also this apartment building. What were some of the other people he worked for, and what did he do for them? Yes,
well, I can start speaking that Gaudí started with the architecture. He wanted the perfection, and the perfection in everything, and ceramics, glass marking, iron and fork, carpentry, etc. And he started by the neo-Gothic style, and this style was inspired by the art of Persia, Japan, etc. To this period belongs Casa Vicens, for instance, Güell Palace, and Capricho de Comillas. Capricho de Comillas is a very important house in Cantabria, outside Catalonia, that Gaudí made when he was very young. Gaudí ended up in modernism in his time of greatest effervescence between the late 19th and early 20th century, And Vicin's house is also an example. But he, as an architect, went beyond modernism, creating his own personal style, as I told you before. And then chronologically, Sagrada Familia was started, as I told you, in 1883. Then Colony Way, it began to be built in 1890. And the promoter was Mr. Güell. There he had his textile industry. He wanted to go outside Barcelona, and he equipped this colony with the most modern technology of the time, and he constructed everything for the workers, his workers, and Gaudí, made all the colony with hospitals, and in schools, shops, theaters, cooperatives, etc. And he also designed the crypt of Colony Way, that was supposed to be the base of the basilica, but then Mr. Well died in 1918, and his sons abandoned the project, and then this project was abandoned. Also, Parkway, that he started afterwards, was in charge by Mr. Well, and it was supposed to be a Garden City project where 60 houses were supposed to be constructed, but it was also this project failed because it was not near the center of the city and people didn't want to go there. And so only 2 houses were made, and one was Gaudí's house. He lived there for several years. Also Casa Batlló House. This is a complete remodeling of a previous existing building. It was not a new house, but just a remodeling of a previous building in Paseo de Gracia. And well, it is crowned with a cross of 4 wings. And this is the period of naturalism of Gaudí, the nature. Also Parkway and Colony Well were just Gaudí's style. Casa Milà, I was speaking, La Pedrera,
right,
was built between 1906 and 1910, and in Paseo de Gracia as well. And then, well, we can speak about Sagrada Familia, but...
Sure, yes, we'll get to that in more detail in a little bit.
Yeah.
When I visited La Pedrera, I trying to roll my R's, yes, but I'm not very good at it. I also found out that Gaudí would design even the furniture sometimes in these places, and even things like the handles of the doors. I think I learned that he would take some clay and just squeeze it in his hand, and that would be the design of the doorknob. He was interested in what would be called now ergonomic things that are very attuned to the shape of the human body. So if you just squeeze some clay and use that resulting shape for the doorknob, then it's going to be a doorknob that feels very natural to the hand, which is very interesting.
Yes. He always designed the furniture, also in Sagrada Familia, in all the buildings he made. It's the furniture, also the doors, the windows, everything was because he had his collaborators and he gave them the guidelines in order to make a complete work, not just the architecture. He was not only an architect, but he made everything in the building.
Now, I understand that he innovated in the area of 3-dimensional design as well. So normally an architect would draw a plan out on paper and it would be necessarily 2-dimensional. But Gaudí found a way to plan his work in 3 dimensions. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I think Gaudí is a precursor of the 3-dimensional design, and the design of Sagrada Familia, which can also be seen in other of his famous works, required 3D models to visualize architectural solutions and analyze structural viability. From the beginning, Gaudí brought together a team of expert modelers, as I told you before, and sculptors, etc., to study solutions, and these solutions are still shown today. He was a strong supporter of 3-dimensional models. One of the contributions to this field is the parabolic or catenary arc system. It consists of a structure that is achieved by suspending a chain at its end, giving rise to the catenary arc. The advantage of this arc is that all the forces of the building are distributed equally and the use of buttresses is not necessary. Casa Milà, for instance, Casa Batlló, Colony Güell, use catenary arcs as well.
And he would put a mirror by it, right, so that you could see it right side up.
Yes. In the models, yeah, he put a mirror, yes, as well, yeah.
Yeah, and you can still see these models today if you go to Barcelona. So let's talk about actually, if one before we talk about the Sagrada Familia, one more question. You mentioned Gaudi's involvement with modernism. Now, when people think of modernism in Spain, they might think of Picasso, Dalí, but this is an earlier modernism than sort of the 20th century modernism. So what's this other Catalan modernist movement?
You mean painters?
In any form of art, because it seems that there were two different modernist movements. There was one that was later that is better known in terms of being more abstract with Cubism and things like that. But then there's this other modernism that Gaudí took part of that is very different.
You mean architects at the time of Gaudí?
Yes, or if it spanned more than one art form. Yeah.
The contemporary architects of Gaudí that followed the modernism, such as Domenic i Muntaner or Puig Cadafalch, that you can see if you visit Barcelona, and they follow and are faithful to the modernism. Gaudí was faithful not to the modernism, but he evolved to be faithful to nature. And he was growing, and this is why people come to Barcelona to visit Gaudí and not to visit the other architects that are very important ones, but they are modernism. And you can see modernism in other parts, in other places, but you cannot see Gaudí if you don't come to Barcelona. So
right.
This is the great thing in Gaudí.
Right. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about the Sagrada Familia, but I guess we could start with its purpose. It's a penitentiary temple. So what does that mean, and why did they build it for that purpose?
Yes, Sagrada Familia is an expiatory temple and has been made from individual effort and has the financial contribution for achieving the pardon of the sins, and is made by means of donations of people. Nowadays it's not like this, because nowadays just the tickets of Sagrada Familia and also the shop in Sagrada Familia permits the following of the construction of Sagrada Familia, but it was thought as an expiatory temple. And this is why Gaudí knew that it was impossible for him to finish his work in life, because it was not possible to get money. Sometimes he was personally to request for money to the rich people in Barcelona. And sometimes they say, well, we are giving you a donation or not. And so because he didn't have money for paying the workers. This Sagrada Familia, it's interesting to know that the promoter of this basilica, the church, was the Association of Devotees of St. Joseph. And it was the former idea was to construct a temple dedicated to St. Joseph, not to La Sagrada Familia, but to St. Joseph. But later on, the idea was changed at the request of the priest Mañanet, who was the founder of Sagrada Familia's congregation, and he requested the committee of the works to change the dedication to Sagrada Familia. And it was supposed to be a simple church mimicking the Loreto in Italy, just one tower and neo-Gothic style. And it was started, as I told you, by the architect Francesc de Paula del Villar, and just one tower dedicated to St. Joseph. Later on, it came Gaudí, and he decided to change everything. And as you know, there will be 18 towers, from which just 8 have been already finished. But the purpose was to get an expiatory temple. This is why Sagrada Familia has not been finished.
Right. So Gaudí knew that it wouldn't be finished in his lifetime, and this is something that was more common, I believe, for people who built churches in the Middle Ages. There were projects that would take centuries to complete, and that was something people, accepted as something greater than themselves. But what was Gaudí's attitude? How did he feel about the fact that it wouldn't be completed in his lifetime? Did that bother him, or was he okay with it?
No, not at all. He was very happy with his masterpiece. to which he dedicated almost 40 years of his life. And the last 12 years or so was exclusively working there. And he knew from the very beginning that it was impossible to finish it, as you said, because a lot of churches have been made and it's impossible to finish them in one life. But he was interested in the future architects and sculptors to finish the work. And so he gave them some models, some drawings. He left everything for them to follow the works. Some people has followed these guidelines, some other have not, and they have changed everything. But there is a guidelines about the finishing of Sagrada Familia. And Gaudí knew that it was impossible to finish the work. In fact, when Gaudí died, only the crypt, the Nativity facade, the apse, and the Rosaries Chapel had been finished. And this is why these parts of the temple have been declared World Heritage by UNESCO, but Sagrada Familia has not yet been declared because it has not been finished yet.
I see. Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's now being funded by tickets of people who want to go and see the church. I understand that after Gaudí's death, the plans were actually destroyed, correct?
Yes. They were kept in the Rosary Chapel, and the collaborators of Gaudí had put a wall, very high wall, in order to prevent the Republicans to go inside the rows, and all these drawings had been kept there. But of course, they go inside and destroyed everything. But at the life of Gaudí, there were two collaborators, two other architects, and then they started they knew exactly what Gaudí wanted, and they reproduced some of the drawings and restored the models, because there were models that were destroyed, but they started to restore these models. So it is not possible to say that there were not models for the future architects. They were, but, well, they had to be restored after the destruction.
I see. So it's not like people who were continuing the work were going based on nothing. They had some idea of what was supposed to be done.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Now, I read that Gaudí went on a 20-day-long fast before beginning work on the church. Is that true?
I don't think so. He started to fast afterwards. The last years of before he died, he was vegetarian and he was making, he didn't eat. Also, he was very ill because he had rheumatic fever and then other fevers, and he was always a sick man, and so he had to keep, he had to go to the doctor, etc. But he wanted also to make, to not to eat in order to be like Jesus Christ.
I see.
To mimic Jesus Christ. But it was not when he started the Sagrada Familia,
okay.
but
I see.
After several years.
Now, I understand there was a gap of time between Gaudí's death and the continuation of work on the Sagrada Familia. How long did it just sort of sit there before people started working on it again?
Yes. Gaudí was preparing the work for the future architects, and also, as you know, he made there were, for instance, he had planned 3 facades, and he just made the one of the Nativity facade because he said that, well, it represented Christmas time and was a great festivity around the world, and he decided not to start with Passion facade because people wouldn't like to continue the works. These things were thought by Gaudí in order to prevent the continuation of the work after his death. And so there are some parts of the temple completed by Gaudí, as the crypt, the facade of the Nativity, the portico, the Rosario, and the apse, parts not performed by Gaudí, but on which he left the instructions which have been followed, the interior of the temple, for instance, the forest full of trees, parts not made by Gaudí, on which he left instructions that have not been followed, like facade of the Passion, and realized parts that he didn't leave instructions, like the stained glass windows that he didn't leave instructions, and unrealized parts on which he left instruction and which are pending to be built. For instance, the facade of the glory, which will be the main entrance of the temple and has not been finished yet.
Oh, I see.
Hope this glory facade, the people follow these guidelines of Gaudí, because he made a guidance for making this facade as well.
Now, as I understand it, because there was a delay in continuing work because of the Civil War and the lack of funding and all these things, when people finally continued work on it, though, there were some architects and sculptors who were very devoted to Gaudí and his ideal. And I read that, I don't remember what year this would have been, but when they started continuing work, they didn't have money. So for a certain amount of time, they were just doing the work for free because they were so dedicated to continuing it. Is that right?
Yes. Especially Mr. Bonet Garí and Isidra Puigboada, the two architects that live and work with Gaudí. When Gaudí died, they followed the works, and when they didn't have money, they follow the works. They were not interested in money because they were very fond on this work. They knew that it was a very important work, and they worked for free if it was necessary.
Now, Gaudí seems to have attracted a big following in Japan, interestingly. And haven't there been some Japanese artists who have come to work on the church as well?
Yes, well, we have Mr. Etsuro Soto, who has been the person who is working in the Nativity facade. He has restored all the statues that had been burned when the Republicans came to the temple. And he could restore the angels, especially the angels that had been destroyed because there were some drawings, some photographs. There is one in the museum. And he followed this guidance and made the restoration. This Mr. Gaudí, my husband, Mr. José Manuel Almuzara, the president of the Association Pro Beatification of Gaudí, gave him, started to explain him the gospel, etc., because he was Buddhist. And then 2 years after learning about the gospel, he decided to get the baptism, and he is Catholic nowadays. He continues to work in Sagrada Familia.
Now, insofar as some of the continuation of the work has not followed Gaudí's plans, has there been some controversy over the finishing of the church in Barcelona?
The people who doesn't want to finish the work, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, nowadays I don't think so, because they understood that it's a very important work, and I think tourists are coming every day to Barcelona, and I think people agree in finishing the work. Some years ago, it was controversial because some people said, well, Sagrada Familia has to be like this, and no continuation of the works, no need to continue the work. But nowadays, I don't think there is a controversial. People are interested in finishing, and now even the architects are in a hurry to finish the works in a few years. In 2026, they expect to finish, to have all the work finished. Well, the architecture.
Oh wow, that's pretty soon.
Yeah, and they are going in a hurry, but I don't think Gaudí would appreciate this work, because Gaudí wanted a good work, and he said that little by little you can do your work better. And even if you saw Sagrada Familia, you have seen the churches that are in Nativity facade, and these turtles represent that you don't have to be in a hurry for finishing a very important work. And he always said, my client is not in a hurry. He always said so because his client was God. And so he always said this to people who always said, Mr. Gaudí, when is expecting to be finished Sagrada Familia? And he said, my client is not in a hurry. And so I don't know what he would think nowadays.
Right. So let's talk about the cause for Gaudí's canonization. What was Gaudí's spiritual life like?
Well, as I told you before, Gaudí, when he started in Sagrada Familia, was not very fond on religion, but he started to pray, started to go to the mass, etc. And we have testimonies of many people who live with him, collaborators, friends, acquaintances, and we have writings, publications about the evidence of Gaudí's sanctity. And so people say that Gaudí in life was a saint that helped people and was devoted to God, and he always wanted to achieve the perfection in his work and life. Although he always said that it was very difficult for him to fight against his strong character, because he had a strong character, but he...
You mean his temper?
Yes. Yes, but
I see.
He evolved during his life and changed completely about his work in Sagrada Familia. It's very important to know that this important event, to have to make a church for an architect, can change your completely your life, and people don't doubt that Gaudí has to be a saint and a reference for the architect. Some historians say that Gaudí constructed Sagrada Familia and Sagrada Familia constructed Gaudí in a spiritual sense.
Wow. Now, he was celibate for his whole life, was he not?
Yes. He was also in his life, he was devoted, and people knew him, and everyone wanted Gaudí because he was also preoccupied with the workers. He also made the schools of Sagrada Familia. These schools were provisional, but he decided to make them for the children of the workers. And he always was thinking about the others, not about him. Even he was not interested in his clothes, in eating. He was not interested in anything but to better make his work in Sagrada Familia and to help people. This is the sanctity in Gaudí.
Do we know why he was celibate? Did he make a vow of celibacy at some point, or is it just sort of...
Well, he wanted to get married, and he had at least 4 possibilities to get married. But the first possibility he had was a girl called Pepita Moreu, and he was from Mataró in the north of Barcelona. She was a teacher. But Gaudí had a problem, and he was very shy. And when finally he decided to speak to her, she said that she was already engaged. Then it came a French girl, and she was engaged in France. And the 2 others became nuns. And then I think Gaudí decided that it was not his destiny to get married. But he was interested in women.
I see. So tell us about Gaudí's death. He always said, I understand, that he wanted to die in a hospital with poor people and sort of unknown.
Yes.
And that's what ended up happening. So tell us about how he died.
Well, Gaudí died as he wanted to die, because Gaudí had a tram accident, as you know, and then he was going to the other church in Barcelona. He always went to this church at the afternoon. And then he came to Sagrada Familia because the 2 last years of his life, he went to live to Sagrada Familia. Firstly, he lived in Parque Güell, but he was at most 74 years old, and he couldn't live in Parque Güell. And then he went to the Mass in Sagrada Familia in the morning, and then in the afternoon, he went to the church Saint Felipe Neri. And he was walking on the street, and he was distracted, and he saw the first tram, but when he went back, the other tram, he had the accident, and he fell almost, he was a very, very serious illness, but had not died. But nobody wanted to pick him up to take him to the hospital because they thought that he was a poor. And then the 3rd or the 4th driver that go there, a policeman said, well, you have to pick this man up and bring him to the hospital. And this taxi driver said, well, as he is a poor, I will bring him to the hospital of the poor people. And then his collaborators at night, when he didn't come back to Sagrada Familia, they were very preoccupied, and they started to look for Gaudí in all the hospitals in Barcelona. And then they arrived to this poor hospital, and the doctor said, no, Gaudí is not here. Of course he's not here. And they said, well, we want to look for Gaudí to all the rooms in order to see whether actually Gaudí is or not. No, it's impossible. And they say, well, we insist. And then they went and they said, this is Gaudí. And so when people realized that it was Gaudí, a lot of people wanted to go to the hospital to visit Gaudí, and a lot of people went to the funeral. But Gaudí had always said that he wanted to be in this hospital of the poor because the nuns help you not for the money, but for the love of God. And so he was very happy, I think, to be there 3 days, and afterwards he died. He died like a poor.
And I read that his last words were, Amen, my God, my God. So, pretty good. So the cause for his canonization began in 92, and how is that going? What progress has been made?
Well, nowadays, the beatification process of Gaudí was open in the Vatican in 2003. And currently the position, which is an extensive document on the history of Gaudí, his reputation for holiness, testimonies of people who knew him in life, etc., is almost completed. When the position is completed, the historical, theological consultants and the ordinary Congress of Cardinals of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome will study Gaudí's positio, and the thing of sanctity, and if the opinion is favorable, because they think that he has exercised the Christian virtues in an heroic rate, a decree will be presented to the Holy Father to authorize its publication. From this moment, Antoni Gaudí can be called venerable, not beatificated, but be called venerable. Afterwards, there will come the beatification, for which is necessary that a miracle was produced. And then the canonization, another miracle is required. And so, as I told you before, Gaudí said, referring to Sagrada Familia, my client is not in a hurry, but little by little we are working in this canonization proceeding.
Gabriela, thank you very much for coming on and telling us about Gaudí.
You're welcome, and I hope you have understand me, because my English is not very good, but
no,
sorry.
I did. If you go to the show notes page for this episode, catholicculture.org/episode 32, you'll see a link to the website for the Association for Beatification of Antoni Gaudí, also to their book, which details his life and his work and his testimonies to his sanctity and things like that. And I also linked to a pretty good gallery of photos of his various buildings. I was trying to find some quotes from Gaudí that I could use at the end of this episode, and I found this little gem which kind of contains a whole theory of art in a nutshell, even on a practical level if you look closely at it. The creation continues incessantly through the media of man, but man does not create, he discovers. Those who look to the laws of nature for support for their new works collaborate with the Creator. Copiers do not collaborate. Because of this, originality consists in returning to the origin. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you again so much to my wonderful, loyal listeners. I love you all. Please continue to give me that feedback. It is much needed, even when it's negative. Saint Joseph, foster father of our Lord, spouse of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and patron of the Universal Church, pray for us.